My daughter uninvited me from her wedding. You are too poor, she told me. I sat on a cold bench with my only sandwich. When I saw a homeless man digging through the trash with his dog, I gave them my dinner. 2 hours later, 15 black BMWs blocked the entrance of the wedding. The man stepped out of the car and said something that made the bride freeze. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment from which city you are watching. That way I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Anna, and I am 65 years old. I never thought my own daughter would break my heart in the cruelest way possible. But that Tuesday in December changed everything I thought I knew about a mother's love. I was standing in front of the mirror at the Elegance Boutique in the Americana Mall, adjusting the navy blue dress I had bought with my last $80 in savings. It was simple, but dignified. It had taken me 3 months to save that money, eating less, walking instead of taking the bus, buying only the essentials, all for the most important day of my daughter Madison's life, her wedding. The dress fit me well for my 65 years. It wasn't made of an expensive fabric like the ones surrounding the store, but it was clean, pressed, and made me feel presentable. That was all I wanted, not to embarrass my daughter on her special day. Madison was on the other side of the fitting room, laughing with her friends as she tried on the pale pink bridesmaid dress. Her laugh had changed over the years. When she was a little girl, after her father Robert died in that accident 28 years ago, her laugh was genuine, full of innocence. Now, at 38, there was something calculated about it, something that made me nervous without knowing why. "Mom, come here," she yelled to me from her fitting room. "I need to talk to you." I walked over with a smile, expecting her to ask my opinion on her dress or to tell me some last-minute detail about the ceremony. I had been waiting for this moment for months. My only daughter was marrying Edward Sinclair, a man from a good, wealthy family. After years of struggling as a single mother, I would finally see Madison settle down, be happy. When I reached her fitting room, she was sitting on the small padded chair, her friends Chloe and Lauren on either side. All three looked at me with an expression I couldn't interpret at first. It wasn't affection, it wasn't excitement for the wedding, it was something cold. "Sit down, Mom," Madison told me, pointing to the small stool in front of her. Her voice had a tone I didn't recognize, as if she were about to scold a problematic employee. I sat down, suddenly feeling the store's air conditioning colder than normal. "Is something wrong, sweetheart? Is there a problem with the wedding?" Madison exchanged looks with her friends before speaking. "Mom, I've been thinking about the wedding. Tell me, how can I help you?" I smiled at her, ready to solve any last-minute problem. It had always been like that between us. She had a problem, I solved it. Edward's family is very exclusive, very elegant. She paused, toying with the engagement ring that sparkled on her finger, a ring that cost more than everything I owned. And I've been thinking that maybe it would be better if you didn't come to the ceremony. For a moment, the words didn't reach my brain. It was as if I had heard a foreign language. "Excuse me? I don't want you to come to my wedding." She said it so directly, so coldly, that I felt as if I had been slapped. "Madison, I don't understand. I am your mother. Of course I am going to be at your wedding." Chloe laughed softly, covering her mouth with her hand, as if she had heard something funny. Lauren looked at her in complicity. My daughter didn't silence them. "Mom, you are too poor." The words fell like stones in still water. "Your clothes, the way you speak, the fact that you live in that horrible apartment on the south side. Edward's family is going to think I come from a low-class family." I felt as if the floor had opened up beneath my feet. "Madison, I sacrificed my whole life for you. When your dad died, I worked 3 jobs to give you the best. I paid for your college. I supported you when you didn't have a job. Exactly," she interrupted me, as if I had proven her point. "You've always been poor, Mom. You've always been the woman who cleans houses, who counts pennies, who buys clothes at thrift stores." She stood up, smoothing out the expensive pink dress. "Edward comes from a family that has had money for generations. I can't present you as my mother." Chloe nodded as if it were the most logical thing in the world. "It's understandable, Anna. Sometimes families just don't mix," Lauren added without looking me in the eyes. "It's better for everyone. Don't you think?" I sat on that small, uncomfortable stool, feeling my entire life crumble in that fitting room full of mirrors that showed me my reflection from all angles. An older woman with wrinkles around her eyes, rough hands from so much work, a cheap dress that I thought was appropriate, but now looked pathetic compared to the clothes surrounding the place. "But I'm your mother," I whispered, and I hated how weak my voice sounded. "And you will always be my mother," Madison said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But that doesn't mean you have to be at my wedding. This is about my future, about the new life I am going to build with Edward. A life that doesn't include you, a life that doesn't include poverty." "Mom, I want more than that. I deserve more than that." The words hurt me more than any physical blow. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling. "Madison, I already bought the dress. I already talked to Mrs. Roberts from the first floor to borrow her black shoes." "Return the dress," she said without flinching. "Get your money back. Use it for something useful." Chloe and Lauren laughed again, and this time Madison joined them. It was a soft laugh, but full of a cruelty I didn't know my daughter possessed. I walked out of the fitting room feeling like I was walking in a nightmare. The bright lights of the boutique hurt my eyes, the smell of expensive perfume made me dizzy, and the sound of my ragged breathing seemed too loud in the silence of the place. I reached the cash register, where a young employee smiled at me professionally. "Everything all right, ma'am? Will you be taking the dress?" I looked back toward the fitting room, where my daughter was still laughing with her friends, probably laughing at me. "No," I told the employee, taking off the dress with trembling hands. "I'm not going to take it." 20 minutes later, I was standing at the bus stop with my refunded money in my purse, feeling the December chill pierce through my thin sweater. People walked past me, each lost in their own life, unaware that a woman's world had just completely collapsed. When I got to my apartment at 23 Maple Street, I sat in my small kitchen and cried like I hadn't cried since the day we buried Robert. But these tears were different. They weren't from the sadness of an inevitable loss. They were from betrayal, from a wound so deep I felt it would never heal. That night, as I lay in my bed looking at the moisture-stained ceiling, I wondered where I had failed as a mother, how I had raised a person capable of such cruelty, how the little girl who used to hug me when she had nightmares had turned into someone who saw me as an embarrassment. I didn't know that the next day, as I walked the streets with a broken heart, I would meet someone who would change everything. I didn't know that my pain that night was just the beginning of a story that would end in a way I could never have imagined. "I don't want you to come to my wedding. You are too poor." The next day dawned gray, as if the sky had decided to match my mood. I hadn't slept all night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Madison's voice telling me I was too poor to be at her wedding. The words repeated over and over until I stopped trying to sleep. I got up at 6 inches the morning, made my watered-down coffee with the last spoonful of sugar left in the jar, and sat at my small kitchen table looking out the window at the street. The neighbors were beginning their morning routines. Mr. Gibson taking out the trash, Mrs. Miller hanging clothes, kids running to school in their wrinkled uniforms. Normal life, normal people, living normal days. While I felt as if I had fallen into a hole I didn't know how to get out of, I decided not to stay in the apartment. The walls felt too close, too full of memories of Madison, when she still needed me, when she still truly loved me. I took my purse with the refund money. I put on my warmest coat and went for an aimless walk. The streets were full of Christmas decorations, bright lights, decorated trees, families buying gifts. Normally, this time of year excited me. Robert and I had always made Christmas special for Madison, even when money was tight. But this year, seeing all these happy families only reminded me of what I had lost. I walked for hours without paying attention to where I was going. My feet automatically took me downtown. I passed in front of stores I could never afford, restaurants where I had never eaten, offices where people worked who probably made in a day what I made in a month with my small pension. It was almost 2 inches the afternoon when I realized I hadn't eaten anything. My stomach growled. But when I checked my purse, I knew I had to be careful with the money. It wasn't just about me anymore. I no longer had Madison to help me in case of an emergency. In fact, I no longer had anyone. I stopped at a small corner store and bought a ham and cheese sandwich for $3. Cheap bread, processed ham, cheese that probably wasn't really cheese, but it was food, and that was all I could afford. With my sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil, I walked to the Central Park, across from St. Michael's Church. I found a cold metal bench under a large tree and sat down, slowly unwrapping my late lunch. The first bite tasted bitter, not because of the food, but because it reminded me of how alone I was. As I chewed in silence, I watched the people walking by. Young couples holding hands, families with children running and screaming with joy, old people feeding pigeons. Everyone seemed to have a place to belong, someone waiting for them at home. That's when I saw him. At first, it was just a blurry figure digging through the trash can on the other side of the path. An older man in dirty, torn clothes, moving papers and garbage, as if looking for something specific. It wasn't an unusual sight in the park, unfortunately, but something made me pay closer attention. It was his posture. Despite the ragged clothes, there was something in the way he moved that didn't seem defeated. And then I saw the dog. A skinny brown animal with white spots waiting patiently next to the man. The dog had a makeshift leash made of old rope, but what caught my attention was the way he looked at the man. With love, with absolute loyalty, the same way I had looked at Madison her whole life. The man pulled something out of the trash. It looked like the remains of a half-eaten burger, and he immediately offered it to the dog. The animal sniffed it, ate it carefully, and then licked the man's hand in gratitude. That simple gesture broke my heart. I looked at my sandwich, still almost whole in my hands, and then I looked at the man and the dog. My stomach was growling with hunger, but there was something in the scene before me that moved me more deeply than my own need. I got up from the bench and walked toward them. "Excuse me," I said softly so as not to startle them. The man looked up. His eyes surprised me. Despite the dirt on his face, despite the unkempt beard and greasy hair, his eyes were clear, intelligent. They weren't the eyes of someone lost to drugs or alcohol. They were the eyes of someone who had seen a lot, who had experienced pain, but who kept something intact inside. "Yes?" His voice was raspy but polite. "Are you hungry?" I asked, feeling the absurdity of the question. Of course they were hungry. The man studied my face for a long moment. "Why do you ask?" "Because I have more food than I can eat." I lied smoothly, extending my sandwich toward him. "And you two look like you need it more than I do." The dog approached first, sniffing my hand with a cautiously wagging tail. The man followed, but with more reserve. "You don't need to do that, ma'am. We are not your responsibility." "It's not about responsibility," I told him. And as I spoke, I realized it was true. It's about humanity. He accepted the sandwich with hands that, despite being dirty, held the food carefully, as if it were something precious. He divided the sandwich into 2 parts, one for him, one for the dog. They both ate slowly, savoring every bite. "What's his name?" I asked, pointing to the dog as I sat on the cold grass next to them. "Buddy," the man said. "It's not very original, but it's honest. He's been my companion for 2 years. And you?" There was a pause. "Marcus. Marcus Wellington. Wellington." That last name sounded familiar to me, but I couldn't place from where. "Anna," I replied. "Anna Morales." We sat in silence while they finished eating. Buddy curled up next to Marcus, and Marcus leaned against the tree. There was something peaceful about the scene, something that contrasted dramatically with the emotional chaos I had been feeling since yesterday. "Can I ask you something, Anna?" Marcus said after several minutes. "Sure. What has you so sad?" The question caught me off guard. Was it that obvious? "How do you know I'm sad?" "A woman doesn't give her only lunch to strangers unless she has a broken heart," he said simply. "And you have the eyes of someone who just lost something very important." I felt the tears starting to form again. My daughter, my only daughter, is getting married tomorrow, and she told me she doesn't want me at her wedding because I'm too poor. Marcus remained motionless for a moment. Buddy lifted his head as if he had sensed the shift in the atmosphere. "Your own daughter told you that?" "Yes." The word came out as a whisper. She said my poverty embarrasses her, that I can't meet her fiancé's family because they'll think poorly of her. Marcus studied me with those clear eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "And what do you plan to do?" "I don't know what I can do." She already made her decision. "I love her with all my soul. I've loved her from the moment she was born. After my husband died, she was all I had left in the world, but she doesn't love you. It wasn't a question, it was an observation, and it hurt because it was true. I don't think she knows what real love is, I admitted. I think she only loves what people can do for her. Marcus nodded slowly. I've met a lot of people like that. People who confuse love with usefulness. Something about the way he said that made me look closer at him. There was something about him that didn't match his appearance, his way of speaking, the way he articulated his thoughts, even his posture when he wasn't acting like someone desperate looking for food. Marcus, I said slowly, can I ask you something now? Of course. Are you really who you appear to be? His smile was small but genuine. He pulled a phone out of his pocket that definitely did not match his ragged appearance. It was black, sleek, clearly expensive. How about I tell you my story, Anna, and then, his eyes hardened slightly, how about we do something about your daughter? The man wiped his hands before holding the very expensive phone. Maybe it's time to meet your daughter. Marcus put the expensive phone back in his ragged pocket and looked at me with an intensity that made me feel like he could see straight into my soul. Buddy curled up closer to him, as if he knew something important was about to happen. Anna, he began, his voice now different, clearer, with an authority I hadn't noticed before. Have you ever heard of Wellington Industries? The name hit me like a lightning bolt. Of course, I had heard of Wellington Industries. It was impossible to live in this city and not know that company. They owned half the buildings downtown, 3 shopping malls, the largest hotel chain in the state. They were rich. Not just rich, but immeasurably wealthy. Yes, I whispered, not understanding where the conversation was heading. I am Marcus Wellington, the founder and CEO of Wellington Industries. For a moment I thought I had misheard, or that the man in front of me had lost his mind. I looked at his torn clothes, his dirty hair, his dirt-stained hands from the trash can. This couldn't be the Marcus Wellington, the man whose photo occasionally appeared in the newspapers, the billionaire who donated millions to hospitals and schools. I don't understand, I said. Marcus ran his hands through his unkempt beard. 3 years ago, I lost my wife and daughter in a car accident. Hit by a drunk driver who had never worked a day in his life, who had never known a struggle, who thought his daddy's money protected him from consequences. His voice cracked slightly as he said this. Buddy lifted his head to lick his hand. After the funeral, I realized I had lived my entire life surrounded by people who only wanted me for my money. Employees who feared me, friends who flattered me, relatives who showed up only when they needed something. No one really knew me. No one loved me for who I was. I was beginning to understand, although it still seemed impossible. So I decided to do an experiment. I left the company in the hands of my most trusted managers. I disguised myself as a homeless man and went out into the streets to meet real people, to see if genuine kindness, selfless love, existed. And what did you find? His smile was bitter. In 3 years, only 3 people have offered me food without expecting anything in return. You are the 3rd, Anna, and the first to treat me as if I were a human being worthy of respect. I sat in silence, processing this information. The richest man in the city had been sitting on the grass with me, eating my cheap sandwich, listening to my problems with genuine patience. Why are you telling me this? Because I recognize pain when I see it. And because after 3 years of seeing the worst of humanity, you have reminded me that kindness still exists in the world. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. And because your daughter represents exactly the kind of person I have learned to despise, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't identify. Part gratitude, part confusion, part something that felt dangerously like hope. What do you mean? Marcus pulled out his phone again and dialed a number. James, it's me. Yes, I need you to look into someone. Madison Morales is marrying Edward Sinclair tomorrow. Yes. That Edward Sinclair. I want to know everything about her in 2 hours. He hung up and looked at me. Anna, trust me. I don't even really know you. That's true, but you know me where it counts. You saw me when you thought I was a nobody, that I had nothing to offer you, and yet you treated me with kindness. That tells me everything I need to know about you. He stood up and held out his hand. Come with me. There's something I want to show you. I hesitated for a moment. This all seemed unreal, like a strange dream. But what else did I have to lose? My daughter had already abandoned me. My heart was already broken. If this man was crazy, at least he had listened to me with more compassion than my own family. I took his hand and stood up. We walked 3 blocks until we reached a building I recognized immediately. The headquarters of Wellington Industries, a glass and steel tower that rose 30 stories into the sky, with the company logo shining in gold letters at the entrance. Marcus guided me to a side entrance I hadn't noticed before. He punched a code into a digital panel, and the door opened silently. A private elevator was waiting for us. "Floor 30, he said to a digital screen, and the elevator began to rise smoothly. During the ride, he looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. "Anna, in a few minutes, you're going to see a part of my world that very few people know, but before the doors open, I need you to understand something." "What?" "Your daughter hurt you in the deepest way possible. She betrayed you, humiliated you, threw you away like trash. And tomorrow, at her wedding, she is going to celebrate that betrayal surrounded by people who will probably applaud her decision." The elevator doors opened to an office that took up the entire floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city stretching out in all directions. Furniture that probably cost more than my entire apartment. Artwork I had only seen in museums. "This isn't about revenge," Marcus continued as we walked toward his desk. "This is about justice. This is about showing your daughter that actions have consequences." He sat behind a massive mahogany desk and touched the surface. A screen emerged from the desk, showing information that made my stomach sink. "Madison didn't just reject you because you're poor, Anna. I looked into her over the last 2 hours, and the truth is much worse than that." On the screen appeared text messages, emails, phone conversations. Madison, talking to her friends, laughing at me, calling me a pathetic old woman, telling stories about how she had had to put up with my poverty her whole life, planning how she was going to get rid of me once she was married to Edward. But the worst came at the end. An audio clip of a phone conversation between Madison and Edward from last week. "Don't worry, babe," my daughter's voice was saying. "Once we get married, I'm going to cut contact with my mother completely. She's a burden, an embarrassment. I'll pretend she's sick or something, and we'll never have to deal with her again." Edward's laugh echoed in the audio. "Perfect. My mother already asked why she hasn't come to any family dinners. I'll tell her you have family issues that you prefer to keep private." "Exactly. And after a few years, if anyone asks, we'll say she died or something. Nobody's going to investigate." The audio ended, and I sat there in complete shock. It wasn't just that Madison didn't want me at her wedding. She had planned to erase me from her life completely, as if I had never existed. Marcus turned off the screen and watched me carefully. "Are you all right?" I was not all right. I was devastated, furious, betrayed in a way I didn't know was possible, but I also felt something else. For the first time in months, I felt clarity. "What do you propose we do?" I asked, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Marcus smiled, and for the first time, it was a genuinely warm smile. "I propose we go to that wedding, Anna. I propose we give your daughter exactly what she deserves." He stood up and walked over to a wall that slid open to reveal a closet larger than my living room, filled with expensive suits, elegant dresses, shoes that shone like mirrors. "But first," he said, pulling out a navy blue dress that was clearly designer, "you are going to that wedding dressed like the queen you are, and I am going to go as your date." "Marcus, I can't accept this." I interrupted him, my voice firm but gentle. "You gave me your only meal when you thought I had nothing. Let me give you this. Let me give you back the dignity your daughter tried to take from you." I looked at the dress, then looked at him, then looked out the windows toward the city where my daughter was probably getting ready for her wedding, believing she had won. At her daughter's wedding, she was going to find out who really mattered. Saturday dawned clear and cold, one of those December days when the sky looked like blue glass. From the window of the hotel where Marcus had insisted I stay the night before, I could see Street, Michael's church in the distance, where in a few hours my daughter would get married, unaware that her world was about to change forever. I hadn't slept well, not from nerves, but from a strange mix of anticipation and pain I couldn't identify. Part of me still couldn't believe all this was happening, that the richest man in the city had appeared in my life exactly when I needed him most, like an avenging angel disguised as a homeless man. At 10 inches the morning, as promised, Marcus arrived at the hotel suite, but this time he wasn't the ragged man I had met in the park. This was Marcus Wellington, CEO. A perfectly tailored black suit, shiny leather shoes, slicked back hair, a precisely trimmed beard. If it hadn't been for his eyes, those same clear, intelligent eyes, I wouldn't have recognized him. "Good morning, Anna. Ready for the most important day of your life?" I had put on the dress he picked out, navy blue, but not the cheap blue of my return dress. This was like the color of the deep ocean, with fabric that draped perfectly over my figure and made me look years younger. The shoes were comfortable but elegant, the purse small but clearly expensive. For the first time in years, I felt beautiful. "I don't know if I'm ready," I admitted, adjusting the pearl earrings that had mysteriously appeared with the dress. "I understand, but remember, we aren't doing this to hurt Madison. We are doing this to show her who her mother really is." Marcus had explained the plan the night before. We would arrive at the church exactly at the time the ceremony was supposed to start. He would introduce himself as my special friend, someone I had recently met and who had insisted on accompanying me to the most important event of my life. Marcus's identity would be revealed gradually, allowing the implications to slowly sink into the minds of everyone present. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked him as we rode the elevator down to the lobby. "This is going to create a scandal. The newspapers, social media." Marcus adjusted his shirt cuffs. "Anna, I've been hiding for 3 years. Maybe it's time the world sees what kind of person I really am, and what kind of people those who think they are superior because they have money really are." Waiting for us in the lobby was something that took my breath away. A line of 15 gleaming black BMWs under the midday sun. Each car had a uniformed chauffeur standing by the rear door. The center car, slightly larger than the others, had personalized plates that read MW. "Is all this necessary?" I asked, suddenly feeling that maybe we had gone too far. "Your daughter rejected you because she thought you were too poor to be at her wedding," Marcus said, opening the door of the center car for me. "I think it's time she understands what power really means." The drive to the church took only 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Marcus didn't speak much during the ride. He just checked something on his phone and occasionally looked at me with a smile that was part conspiratorial, part protective. "Anna," he said, "when we were 2 blocks from the church, I want you to know that whatever happens in the next few hours, you are not alone. You will never be alone again if you don't want to be." We arrived exactly at 1 p.m., the scheduled start time for the ceremony. The 15 cars parked in perfect formation in front of the church, completely blocking the main entrance. The chauffeurs stepped out simultaneously and opened the rear doors, even though only 2 of the cars had passengers, Marcus and me. The effect was exactly what Marcus had planned. The guests heading into the church stopped dead in their tracks. Some pulled out their phones to take pictures. Others just stood staring, wondering what dignitary or celebrity had arrived at the event. Marcus stepped out first, adjusted his suit jacket, and then offered me his arm with the courtesy of a true gentleman. As we walked toward the church doors, I could see the guests' faces shift from curiosity to gradual recognition. "Is that—" I heard someone whisper. "It can't be. Marcus Wellington? What is he doing here? Who is the woman with him?" The church doors were open, and from outside I could hear the sound of the organ playing the bridal chorus. The ceremony had begun. Madison was walking down the aisle at this very moment, probably feeling like the queen of the world, having no idea that her world was about to collapse. Marcus and I stopped at the entrance. Inside the church, I could see the backs of the guests' heads. At the front, Edward waited at the altar with his best man, and there, walking slowly down the aisle in a white dress that probably cost more than my rent for a whole year, was my daughter. She looked beautiful, I had to admit. The dress fit her perfectly. Her hair was styled in an elaborate bun, and she wore a pearl necklace that glistened in the candlelight. For a moment, my heart broke again, remembering the little girl who used to play wedding with her dolls, insisting that I be her maid of honor. But that moment quickly passed when I remembered the audio I had heard yesterday, the cruel words, the plans to erase me from her life, the cold laugh as she discussed my future as if it were a problem to be solved. "Ready?" Marcus whispered. I nodded. And together we crossed the threshold of the church. The effect was immediate and devastating. Heads began to turn. First a few, then more and more, until a wave of murmurs and gasps filled the church. The bridal chorus was abruptly interrupted when the organist got distracted by the commotion. Madison, who was only a few steps from the altar, stopped and turned to see what had caused the interruption. When she saw me, her face went through a series of emotions in a matter of seconds: confusion, shock, horror, and finally something that can only be described as pure terror. But when her eyes moved to Marcus, who was walking confidently by my side, her face turned completely pale, as if she had seen a ghost. Edward, from the altar, frowned, trying to understand what was happening. His family, sitting in the front rows, exchanged looks of confusion, but the guests who knew who Marcus Wellington was had begun to whisper louder, and his name spread through the church like wildfire. Marcus calmly guided me to an empty pew in the back. We sat down as if we were normal guests, arriving a little late to a normal ceremony. He kept his arm lightly around my shoulder, a silent but clear statement that we were together. The priest, clearly confused by the interruption and the murmurs, tried to resume the ceremony. "We can continue with the march." But Madison wouldn't move. She stood in the aisle, her bouquet of white roses trembling in her hands, staring at me as if she couldn't believe I was there. Her humble roots, which she thought had died and gone long ago, had been replaced by me in her mind as the source of all shame. And now, on the day that was supposed to be her supreme triumph, there I was, clearly not poor, clearly accompanied by the most powerful man in the city. Edward finally stepped down from the altar and walked toward her. "Madison, what's wrong? Who is that woman?" His voice carried throughout the church, in the tense silence that had fallen over the congregation. Marcus stood up slowly, his presence commanding the attention of the entire church. When he spoke, his voice was clear, authoritative, impossible to ignore. "The woman is Anna Morales, and I am Marcus Wellington." A pause as he let the information sink in. "Anna is the mother of the bride, and I am here because yesterday, when I was disguised as a homeless man, she gave me her only meal without expecting anything in return." Total silence fell over the church. Even the small children had stopped making noise. "I am here," Marcus continued, "because I wanted to meet the daughter of such an extraordinarily generous woman. I wanted to see what kind of person someone with such kindness in her heart had raised." Madison dropped her bouquet. The white roses scattered across the church's marble floor. Edward turned to her, his face a mask of confusion and growing horror. "This is your mother? The mother you said was too sick to come to the wedding?" Edward stared at Madison with disgust. "We're canceling everything, right now." The silence in the church was so profound I could hear my own heart beating. Madison stood in the aisle, surrounded by scattered white roses, her wedding dress wrinkling as her hands shook uncontrollably. Edward looked at her as if he had never seen her before in his life. "Cancel?" Madison's voice came out as a high-pitched shriek that echoed against the stone walls of the church. "Cancel our wedding for her?" Edward took a step away from her as if being near her would contaminate him. "You lied to me, Madison. You told me your mother was too sick to come. You told me it was a painful situation that you preferred to keep private." "And it is!" Madison yelled, her perfect composure finally collapsing. "She is an embarrassment. She lives in a horrible apartment. She wears cheap clothes. She works cleaning houses. I didn't want your family to think I came from poverty." Marcus slowly stood up from our pew, his presence filling the space like a silent storm. "Miss Morales," he said, his voice polite, but with an edge that made several guests sit up straighter in their seats. "Could you explain to your fiancé what I heard yesterday in your phone conversations?" Madison grew even paler. If that was possible. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do." Marcus pulled out his phone and held it up. "Do you want me to play the recording where you tell Edward that you plan to cut contact with me completely after the wedding? The part where you suggest telling people that your mother died so you wouldn't have to explain why they never see her?" Edward stepped back as if he had been struck. "You said that? That's not what it looks like." Madison reached out to him desperately, but Edward held up his hands to keep her away. "It's not what it looks like?" Edward's voice rose, full of disgust. "Madison, you plan to pretend your own mother is dead? How can I trust someone capable of that? How can I bring someone like that into my family?" That was when Edward's mother, Rose Sinclair, stood up from the front row. She was an elegant woman in her 60s, dressed in a champagne-colored silk suit with real pearls around her neck. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Edward, come here, right now." Edward walked toward his mother like a scolded child. Rose took his arm and spoke loudly enough for the whole church to hear. "I will not allow someone with such low morals to marry my son. Someone who can abandon her own mother is someone who will eventually abandon her husband." She looked directly at Madison. "This wedding is not going to happen." Madison stumbled as if she had been physically struck. "You can't do this! We already paid for everything. The guests are here. The reception hall is booked." "All of that can be canceled," Rose said coldly. "But once we allow someone without principles into our family, the damage would be permanent." Edward nodded, his decision clearly made. "Madison, this is over. I can't marry someone who treats her own mother like trash." That was when Madison looked directly at me for the first time since I had entered the church. Her eyes, which had once been the innocent eyes of my little girl, now burned with pure hatred. "This is all your fault!" she screamed at me, pointing a trembling finger. "You ruined my life. You came here to destroy my happiness." I stood up slowly from the pew, feeling all the eyes in the church focusing on me. Marcus put a gentle hand on my shoulder, but I knew this was something I had to do alone. "Madison," I said, my voice calmer than I felt, "I didn't ruin your life. You ruined your own life when you decided that the love I gave you for 38 years was worth nothing. You never understood," Madison sobbed. "You were always poor. You were always an embarrassment. I wanted something better for myself." "And you could have had it," I replied, walking slowly down the center aisle. "You could have had a better life and still respected me. You could have grown, progressed, found success, and still loved me." Tears ran down her face, ruining her perfectly applied makeup. "But you embarrassed me." "No, sweetheart. What embarrassed you was your own lack of character." Marcus had started to walk behind me, but he stopped at a respectful distance. "This was between my daughter and me. Madison, I gave you everything I had. When your dad died, I worked 3 jobs to give you a good education. I bought you the clothes you wanted, even if it meant I didn't buy anything new for years. I paid for your college. I supported you when you couldn't find a job. I lent you money you never paid back. That was your responsibility as a mother. Yes, it was my responsibility to raise you, but it was not my responsibility to allow you to treat me like trash. It was not my responsibility to accept being erased from your life." Edward had been listening to this entire exchange with a look of growing horror. Finally, he spoke, addressing Madison directly. "For 6 months you've been telling me your mother was too sick to meet my family. I made up excuses to my parents about why you never brought her to family events, and it was all a lie. I did it for us," Madison cried desperately, "so we could have a better life." "A life built on lies is not better, Madison. It's hollow." Rose Sinclair approached me, completely ignoring Madison. When she spoke to me, her voice was formal but respectful. "Mrs. Morales, I owe you an apology. My son told me you were too sick to join us for family dinners. If I had known the truth, I would have invited you personally." Marcus stepped up now, standing by my side. "Rose, please allow me to formally introduce you to Anna Morales, one of the noblest women I have ever met in my life." Rose extended her hand to me and I took it, feeling strangely calm in the midst of all this chaos. "It is an honor to meet you, Anna. I deeply regret the circumstances." Madison watched this exchange with a look of total disbelief. Her perfect world, her perfect plan, was crumbling right before her eyes. "You can't do this," she screamed again. "I invested everything in this relationship. I quit my job. I gave up my apartment. I have nowhere to go." Marcus looked at her with an expression that could have frozen water. "Miss Morales, you had a mother who loved you unconditionally, who would have done anything for you. You had a home. You had family. You chose to throw all of that in the trash for money and status. I chose something better." "No," I said. My voice was firm, but not cruel. "You chose something empty. You chose an illusion over reality. And now, you have to live with those consequences." Edward took the wedding ring off his finger and placed it on the nearest pew. Madison, I want you to get your things out of my apartment and leave. I don't want to see you again. Edward, no. Madison ran toward him, but he pulled away. There is nothing more to say. This is over. Marcus gently took my arm. Anna, I believe it's time we leave. You've done what you came here to do. As we walked toward the church exit, I could hear Madison sobbing behind us, begging Edward to change his mind, pleading with Rose to forgive her, but her words fell on deaf ears. Outside, the 15 black BMWs were still parked, gleaming in the afternoon sun. Marcus helped me into the center car, and as we drove away from the church, I turned to look one last time. Madison was standing on the church steps, in her wrinkled wedding dress, completely alone. The guests were dispersing, some talking quietly among themselves, others taking pictures with their phones. Madison, her mother, or her new life, she couldn't have both. 6 months after the wedding that never was, I was sitting on the balcony of my new apartment in the city's most exclusive district, drinking coffee from a real porcelain cup and watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold. The apartment Marcus had insisted on giving me was larger than anywhere I had ever lived, with high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a view that stretched for miles. But it wasn't the luxury that made me happy. It was the peace. My new life had begun the Monday after the interrupted wedding. Marcus had kept every promise he made to me that day in his office. He had offered me a job as Director of Family Services at the Wellington Foundation, an organization that helped families in crisis. My salary of $5,000 a month was more money than I had made in my entire life. But more importantly, the job gave me purpose. Every day I woke up knowing I was going to help other mothers who had been abandoned by their children, other fathers who had sacrificed everything for families that didn't appreciate them. It was a job that required my life experience, my understanding of pain, my ability to find hope in the midst of despair. Marcus had become something I never expected to find at 65. A true friend. There was no romance between us. We were both too scarred by our past for that, but there was a deep understanding, a mutual respect that had grown since that day in the park when I shared my sandwich with a stranger. Buddy, Marcus's faithful dog, had found a permanent place in my apartment. Marcus said the dog had chosen me from the first day and that he had only been looking after him until he could find his true home. Every morning, Buddy sat next to me on the balcony, his head resting on my lap, while I drank my coffee and planned the day. The first time Madison tried to contact me was 2 weeks after the canceled wedding. I received a text message that said, "Mom, we need to talk." Things got complicated. I deleted it without replying. The second time was a month later. This time it was a phone call I didn't answer, followed by a voicemail. "Mom, I know you're mad, but I'm your daughter. You can't cut me out of your life forever." I deleted that message too. By the third month, her attempts to contact me had become more desperate. Long emails explaining that it had all been a misunderstanding, that she truly loved me, that she had been under a lot of pressure for the wedding and hadn't been thinking clearly. She had asked neighbors at the old building to try and find out where I lived now. She had even shown up at my previous job, only to discover I no longer worked there. Marcus had offered to get a restraining order, but I told him it wasn't necessary. Madison would eventually give up when she realized it wasn't going to work. And I was right. After the 4th month, the messages stopped. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Madison had had to move back in with a friend, that she had been struggling to find a job after the story of the canceled wedding spread through her social circle. Edward had moved to another city, apparently to start over, far from the scandal. Part of me felt bad for her. Part of me missed the little girl she had been before greed and shame twisted her heart. But a larger part of me, the part that had learned to value herself, knew I had made the right decision. The ring of my phone interrupted my morning thoughts. It was Marcus. "Good morning, Anna. Ready for another day of changing lives?" I laughed. Something I had rediscovered how to do these past few months. Always ready. "What do we have today?" A 50-year-old mother whose son has been emotionally blackmailing her for money for years. She just found the courage to cut contact, but she needs support. Perfect. I'll see her in an hour. After hanging up, I sat there for a few more minutes, enjoying the quiet of the morning. Buddy stretched and yawned. Then he looked at me with those wise eyes that seemed to understand everything. "You know what, Buddy?" I said, scratching him behind the ears. I think I finally understand what it means to truly be free. It was true. For 38 years, my identity had been completely intertwined with being Madison's mother. Everything I did, every decision I made, every sacrifice I made was about her. Her happiness had been my happiness. Her success had been my success. Her approval had been my validation. But now, for the first time in decades, I was simply Anna, not someone's mother, not someone's employee, not someone's responsibility. I was a woman with her own dreams, her own goals, her own worth, which didn't depend on anyone else. My work at the Wellington Foundation had taught me that my story wasn't unique. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of parents who had been thrown away by narcissistic children who saw them only as resources to be exploited. But there was also hope. There were people who had found the strength to break free, to build new lives based on mutual respect instead of toxic obligation. Around 10 inches the morning, as I was getting ready to go to work, I heard a soft knock on my door. When I looked through the peephole, my heart stopped for a moment. It was Madison. She looked terrible. Her hair, which she had always kept perfectly styled, was unkempt. Her clothes, though still good quality, were wrinkled as if she had slept in them. She had lost weight and had deep dark circles under her eyes. For a moment, the mother in me wanted to open the door, hug her, ask her what was wrong. But I stood my ground. Instead of opening the door, I spoke through it. Madison, I have nothing to say to you. Mom, please, I just want to talk to you for 5 minutes. We have already said everything we had to say. Mom, I was wrong. I admit it, I was terribly wrong. But you are my mother. You can't abandon me forever. Her words hurt me because, for a moment, they sounded genuine. But then I remembered all the previous times she had sounded genuine when she wanted something. I remembered the audio Marcus had shown me. I remembered the cruel laugh in her voice when she planned to erase me from her life. Madison, I didn't abandon you. You abandoned me. You chose to cut our relationship when you decided that my love wasn't worth as much as Edward's money. But things changed. Edward is gone. I lost everything. And there it was. The truth behind her regret. She wasn't here because she had realized she loved me. She was here because she had lost everything else, and now she needed me again. Madison, if Edward had decided to marry you despite everything, you never would have come here. If you had found another rich relationship, you never would have thought of me again. Silence on the other side of the door. That's not true. We both know it is. Mom, I'm your only daughter, and you decided I wasn't, that you weren't my mother. More silence, then soft sobs. I have no one else. That was your choice, sweetheart. You had someone who loved you unconditionally, and you chose to throw that love in the trash for money and status. What am I supposed to do now? What any adult does. Find a way to live with the consequences of your decisions. The sobs grew louder. Part of me wanted to open the door, because despite everything, I loved her. But loving someone doesn't mean allowing them to destroy you. Madison, I wish you the best in life. I hope you find happiness, that you learn from this, that you become a better person. But I cannot be part of your life again. Not after what you did. Goodbye, Madison. I waited until I heard her footsteps fading down the hallway. Then I waited 10 more minutes before opening the door to make sure she was gone. When I finally stepped out, there was no trace of her. That night, Marcus came over for dinner at my apartment, as he did once or twice a week. I told him about Madison's visit while I prepared lemon chicken with the herbs I grew on my balcony. "How do you feel?" he asked as he poured the wine. "Free," I replied immediately. "For the first time in my life, I feel completely free. No guilt, no blame." Marcus smiled and raised his glass. "Then, let's toast to freedom. And to second chances. And to friendship," I added. "And to finding family in unexpected places." That night, after Marcus left, I sat on my balcony with Buddy at my feet, watching the city lights stretch out to the horizon. My phone was silent. My heart was at peace. My conscience was clear. I was 65 years old, and I had finally learned the difference between love and obligation, between sacrifice and self-destruction, between real family and people who just share your blood. Madison had chosen money over love. Edward had chosen integrity over convenience. Marcus had chosen kindness over cynicism, and I had chosen my own dignity over guilt. In the end, we had all gotten exactly what we deserved. Anna closed the door. For the first time, she felt no guilt,